the first one we're going to be looking at is European developments and divisions. And we're going to be looking at kind of what happened in Europe with the Anabaptists after the original people. And just so that we get kind of a feel for where we are, you'll remember that last night when we talked about some of the original Anabaptists, Conrad Grebel, Felix Mons, they were located in Zurich. I don't know if you can see that, in the city of Zurich there in Switzerland. And that was sort of where Anabaptism started, and yet some people are a little unsure or aren't quite willing to say that that's the starting point because there were kind of different movements kind of throughout Europe that kind of eventually came into Anabaptism as well and adopted Anabaptist beliefs as well. But that's sort of where the big, that's the big focus point that most people give is Zurich there. But throughout the next couple decades, there are kind of two main groups of Anabaptists. The first is down in Switzerland, in Zurich and around there in what is called the Emmental Valley. And the other group is up in the Netherlands, up here. You see the city of Dordrecht there, which some of you might have heard of, and we'll talk more about that later. But there are kind of the two concentrations. We're in the Netherlands and in Switzerland. Menno Simons in the 1540s and 50s was up in the Netherlands, and of course that's where Mennonites get their names. But actually, most of us would be from Swiss and German heritage, which would have been mostly down in here. And I think, yeah, pretty much all of us would be from the Swiss Brethren, unless you have some Russian heritage there, which we'll talk about later as well. And we'll also talk about why we ended up with the Mennonite name as well. But so those are kind of the two concentrations that you can think of, and the two divisions. The ones up north were called the Mennonites. The ones in the south are often called the Swiss Brethren, at least early on. And one of the biggest issues that they faced in the 1500s, again, remember 1525 is when the first baptism happened, that's when this movement started, and as we go on. But throughout the 1500s, one of the biggest issues they dealt with was church discipline. And in helping us get ready to think about this, we talked about it a little bit last night, but in getting us prepared, I want to read a couple scriptures. Could I have a volunteer to read Matthew 18, verses 15 to 20? Thank you. And a volunteer to read 1 Corinthians 5, verses 9 through 11. 1 Corinthians 5. Thank you. Connor, you can go ahead with that when you're ready. Thank you. In 1 Corinthians 5, 9 through 11.
I wrote unto you in an epistle not to company with fornicators, yet not altogether with the fornicators of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or with idolaters, for them must be needs go out of the world. But now I have written unto you not to keep company, if any man that is called a brother be a fornicator, or covetous, or an idolater, or a railer, or a drunkard, or an extortioner, with such an one not to eat.
Thank you. So those are the two kind of key passages in the Bible about excommunication and church discipline. And something that the Anabaptists wrestled with was how do we apply these? So we have the Matthew 18, the three admonitions. You go one-on-one, you bring a couple brothers, and then you bring it to the church. And if he's not willing to repent, you excommunicate him. And then in 1 Corinthians, Paul says not to eat with these people. So how do we interpret that? And there were several different ways that they interpreted it. So we'll start with the Swiss Brethren in the south. For most of the 1500s, they were mostly united, and they felt like we should apply the three admonitions pretty much for any offense. do the 3 admonitions. If they're not willing to repent, we excommunicate them. And the question of when do we eat with them becomes a question of, is Paul talking about just the Lord's Supper and communion, or is he talking about any meal at all, or what they would call the common meal? So how does this apply to married couples? If, say, the man is excommunicated, is the wife allowed to eat with her husband or live with her husband still, or should she leave? And the Swiss generally, and of course there was some disagreement in this as well, but for the most part they were united in this. They said that he meant the communion meal. So he didn't mean common meals. You could have, if it was a family member, you could still eat with them, but this was just communion. In the north, with the Dutch Anabaptists, was a little bit more controversial. We had Menno Simons, who was pretty similar to that, at least when he was younger. He tended to say more, use the 3 admonitions, and mostly just don't eat communion with them. But as he got older, he started shifting a little bit more and getting a little more stricter and saying for like very bad sins, you don't have to do the full 3 admonitions. You can excommunicate them. If they do something really bad, you can just excommunicate them right away. And he said that married couples should split up and so on. And some of that was influenced by 2 other leaders in the Dutch Anabaptists by the name of Leonard Bouwens and Dirk Phillips. And Bouwens and Phillips were very strict on this. They got to the point where they said pretty much most offenses you don't use the 3 admonitions, only for like minor offenses. You do the 3 admonitions, otherwise you just excommunicate them right away, and you don't eat any meals with the excommunicated person. And that led to some issues. There was a group in the very north of the Netherlands who disagreed with Phillips and Bouwens and said, no, we don't have to be that strict about it. Married couples can stay together. And they had a case where a woman or a man was excommunicated and his wife kept living with him and eating with him and so on. And Bouwens was like, you need to excommunicate this woman because she's living with him. And they said no, but Bouwens went ahead and excommunicated her anyway. And I think the book mentions that for us that seems a little weird for a minister to excommunicate someone from a different congregation, but for them that would have been a little bit more normal. But still this group was not very happy, so they split off from the other Dutch Anabaptists, and they called themselves the Doopsgezinde, or something like that. And it basically means baptism-minded, which is kind of what Anabaptists in general are about, but a focus on the second baptism, and they were a little less strict on what the ban means. Interestingly enough, Bouwens called them the garbage wagon. I guess because he thought that was a good name for them. And then a little farther along, in the 1560s now, Menno Simons died in 1561, and it was soon after this that there was another division among the Dutch Mennonites called the Frisian-Flemish division, where the Frisians and the Flemish disagreed. It's kind of disputed as to what all was disagreed upon, but mostly it seems like it wasn't core doctrinal issues. It was more just like, what does the book say? Was procedures of discipline and how to apply principles such as simplicity, not about doctrine. I don't know if that sounds familiar at all. And the book also gives a story about how they tried to be reconciled and it didn't work out because of their pride and their unwillingness to humble themselves to each other. But that's some of what happened up in the Netherlands. But by 1575, so we're now about 50 years after the beginning of this movement, a lot of the persecution in the Netherlands actually stopped. And they weren't persecuted as much. And this meant that the Mennonites up there actually started getting a little more wealthy. They could have businesses, they could make money, they were hard workers, and they started to actually be pretty prosperous. And with this, with their money and extra time that they had, they started publishing some things. One of the things they published was, and this is now a while later, the Dordrecht Confession of Faith. This was in 1632 now. which many of you have probably heard of. It's the confession of faith that the Amish still use, if I'm correct. And it was basically a laying out of their doctrine and what they believe. Another thing that they published in the Netherlands was the Martyr's Mirror, which was published in 1660. It was a compilation of stories of martyrs from the early church and from Anabaptists, telling their stories and writing them all down. And this prosperity ended up being, as is going to be a theme throughout our night tonight, a bit of a mixed bag. While they, being rich helped them publish these things that were important, that we still have today, they helped out other Anabaptists who were struggling. But they also started integrating into broader culture. As they started interacting with them in business, they started looking like them and starting to become like them more. It's hard to see the split between your two cultures when the one culture isn't actively trying to kill you. So that is, very quickly, the story of the Dutch, and we'll leave them for now. And we'll move to the south, back down to Switzerland, in Zurich. And in Switzerland, they were facing a lot of persecution. And so a lot of the Swiss brethren started moving north a little bit farther to several regions. The first was the Alsace in France. So you can see it's there in the eastern part of France, and the Palatinate, which is in the western part of Germany, or what is today Germany. Back then, I think it was controlled by Austria. But those were two regions where a lot of Swiss brethren moved, and that's also probably where a lot of our ancestors are from, as they were facing persecution down in Switzerland. As we talk about the Swiss brethren, I want to talk about, one of the biggest things I want to talk about is the Amish-Mennonite split, which happened in 1693. So now we're skipping ahead pretty far here. This is about 150 years now after the original Anabaptists, 1693. And the main issues that were associated with this split were how do we deal with what they call the true-hearted and the ban. The true-hearted were people who didn't want to join the church, but who were friendly to the Anabaptists, who gave them food, gave them shelter, protected them, so on and so forth. Some ministers were saying these people are saved because they're helping us. Some people are saying they're not saved because they're not a part of the church. So how do we view this? And the other one was the ban, again. So about 100 years after the Dutch Anabaptists faced this issue, now the Swiss brethren are coming at it and saying, okay, how strict are we again? And it was the same two issues about, do we use the three admonitions, and do we eat with the people who are excommunicated? There are also some other minor issues, including feet washing, simple clothing, and beards for men. Most of those three things were all things that Jacob Ammon really wanted and thought that we should be doing. Jacob Ammon was from the Alsace in France. So again, that's one of the regions where they had moved from from Switzerland. And he got it in his mind that we should be applying the ban a lot stricter than we are. So he went about the churches in Switzerland, and he started asking them, how are you applying the ban? And he came to find out that many of them were not doing it the way he thought we should be doing it, as strict as we should be doing it. And eventually this came to a head when he confronted another minister by the name of Hans Reist for not disciplining a woman who had lied in his church. And there was this whole thing where he accused Reist, and then some other ministers said, all right, let's bring them together. They brought Jacob Ammon and Hans Reist together to a meeting. Hans Reist refused to come, and Jacob Ammon at this meeting goes ahead and excommunicates Reist, and then he asks about 5 of the ministers there what they think about the ban, and finds out they agree with Reist, so he excommunicates them too. And this caused a big split, and as you can imagine, the followers of Jacob Ammon became known as the Amish. And to this day, you can see the connections there with the application of the ban being stricter than Mennonites, he believed that the true-hearted were not saved, that you had to be a part of the church. He advocated for feet washing as an ordinance, which the Mennonites didn't do for a while. He also wanted simple clothing and beards for the men, which still stand today. Over the years, there were some, as I think around the year 1700 or so, Jacob Ammon and some of the other Amish leaders kind of repented of this and wanted to, felt bad about it, and so they actually excommunicated themselves from the church as well as kind of a symbol of their humility. But it didn't really work, and there wasn't a whole lot of coming back together, and so then there were kind of these two different divisions, the Mennonites and the Amish. And he took a lot of the churches, so going back to this map, if I can get back there, a lot of the churches in the Alsace tended to be Amish, and the Palatinate tended to be a little bit more Mennonite, and there was some interchange there too as well. But the Alsace was where Ammon was from, and that's where he tended towards. Oops, okay. So before we go on, any thoughts on church discipline, how we do that, and how we think about the different splits that have come because of it in our history? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's how some they would have applied it at times. Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. He wasn't. There were others that agreed with him, but he was kind of the firebrand and the leader. Yeah, one of the other big ones was his brother Uli, or I think there's debate about whether he was actually his brother or a relative of some sort, but Uli Ammon was another early leader of the Amish. Yeah. All right, well, we'll move on to the second lesson, which is going to be a little bit of a break. We're going to take another look back up to the Dutch Anabaptists and where they went. Excuse me. So as the years went on, there was some more, there we go. There was some more persecution that came for the Dutch Anabaptists up in Netherlands, which is over here now. And even before there was persecution there were some that were moving over into Poland, into Northern Europe there. And I have labeled there Poland and Prussia, and then also Ukraine, which we'll get to later. So this whole area that's labeled Poland and Prussia is modern-day Poland, but back then it was more divided up. So they started moving into Poland, and this was moved along in 1642. So now we're moving back again in the timeline. 1642, when King Vladislav of Poland issued an edict favoring Mennonites. So I don't know exactly what all was involved in this edict, but gave breaks for them farming, gave them breaks from military duty, which was a big deal for them because they were non-resistant. But eventually, they started prospering, and this is going to be a pattern that we're going to see with these Mennonites, is they started prospering, and people started getting jealous because they're prosperous, and hey, our sons have to go off to war and die, but they just get to stay home and keep making money. Like, how is that fair? So the king revoked this military exemption, which caused them to move a little west farther into Prussia. And they kind of found their place a little bit in Prussia. But then in 1786, so now we're way forward, so 1786, we're now in the time of the American Revolution, a little after. Catherine the Great of Russia invited Mennonites in, and, well, she started off by issuing an edict that basically gave a break for any German immigrants that want to come, or any Prussian immigrants that want to come. But then she sent a specific letter to the Anabaptists, to the Mennonites who were living in Prussia, and said, come, I'll give you a bunch of land. You can live on my land. And these were the terms that were agreed on. Number one, they must remain separate from the general public. So they had their own self-governing communities. They had complete religious freedom. They had complete military exemption. But they were not permitted to proselytize Orthodox Russians. They were allowed to proselytize Muslims that were there. Each family would receive 175 acres of land, but they were not permitted to parcel it off. They would be reimbursed for their travel and would be tax exempt for several years. So this was a great deal for these Mennonites who were facing a lot of hardships in Prussia. So they moved over to Russia, and it wasn't easy at first. Of course, moving your whole family over there was hard. They had to get used to farming in a different kind of land. It wasn't very easy for them at first. There was also some issues with inheritance because they weren't allowed to divide up these parcels, but a lot of them had big families. So you're not allowed to divide up the parcel. That means the land goes to the oldest son, and all the rest are left without land, and so they have to be servants to other landowners or find another way of making money. And so it was tough at first, but eventually they started getting their feet under them and started making money and being more prosperous. And again, prosperity is a mixed bag. They do some good with their money. They build hospitals and schools and are, doing good things with their money, but they're also starting to get more acculturated. It was a little less maybe than the Dutch faced because they were in their isolated communities, but it was still there nonetheless. And then in 1874, so we're getting pretty recent here, military exemption was revoked in 1874. After some conversations with the government and stuff, they were allowed to do alternative service. But when this was revoked, a lot of them migrated to Canada. And this is where you'll find a lot of the Russian Mennonites today. There are communities in Canada, and they eventually also split off into Central and South America. There are a bunch in Belize. I think maybe Paraguay has some. But these are pretty much the only descendants of actual Mennonites from the Netherlands would have gone through Russia first and then to the Americas. So that's why I said that pretty much none of us are actually descended from the original Mennonites. There are some in Kansas as well, yeah. There would be some Russian Mennonites there, yeah. And I think maybe in other parts of the Midwest too, I'm not exactly sure, but. I think some of both. There were some that went directly to Kansas, but I think some went from Canada too. Yeah. Actually, there was a note in the book about the kind of wheat that they brought apparently what helped save Kansas wheat production apparently, but yeah. But for the ones that did stay in Russia, eventually they faced World War I. And so again, they're at this tenuous spot where they're still required to do military service, but they can do an alternative service. And suddenly Russia's at war with Germany, and the Russian people don't like these people very much because they speak German, and they're not helping in the military. And that seems suspicious. And so they don't like these people very much, and there's a lot of animosity towards them. And then in 1917, we have the Bolshevik Revolution, where the Soviets rose up and overthrew the government, and the Mennonites were caught in the crossfire in some of this. Their farms were ravaged, and there was especially one guy who was in charge of a local area there who had something against the Mennonites. He had worked as a farmhand for them apparently, and he just came through and absolutely, wiped out their farms as much as he could. And in response to this, some of the younger, there we go. Oh, I don't have that up there. In response to that, some of the younger Mennonites took up arms and joined the fighting, trying to defend their farms, which just caused more animosity of these people that were fighting back. But that's most of the Russian Mennonite story. And now we're going to move on to North America. I think maybe we should take a little break here. Take like a 3-minute break, and then we'll come back. All right. So we're going to move on to a new continent. So we're going to back up again in the timeline a little bit here to the 1600s. And throughout the 1600s, Anabaptists in the Alsace and the Palatinate, which remember they moved there from Switzerland, still faced a lot of persecution. For the most part, they weren't being killed anymore, but a lot of the persecution came in like social pressures and also in legal pressures. One of the biggest things was that these Anabaptists were not a part of the state church, which means their marriages weren't performed in state churches, which means their marriages weren't valid, which meant, as Conrad mentioned the other night, their children, or was it last night, their children were considered illegitimate children and they couldn't inherit land, which meant it was very hard for Anabaptists, especially a few generations on, to have land. Or at least own it. And so they faced a lot of persecution in that way, and they were looking for something better. William Penn was a British Quaker who had this vision for creating a colony where there would be religious freedom, where anyone of any religion would be allowed to practice their religion, which for this time was pretty surprising, and wouldn't have been what you would expect. I think today we think of America as a whole as that, but at that point it wasn't. At that point there were a few colonies in Virginia, which was a Catholic colony because it was, Virginia was Catholic, right? No? Maryland was Catholic. I don't remember. What was that? Anglican, yes. Virginia was Anglican because it was founded by the English. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was Puritan, founded by the Puritans. And they were pretty strictly that denomination, especially the Massachusetts Bay Colony was pretty strict on their church rules and their church discipline as well. But William Penn decided to found Pennsylvania as a colony that had freedom of religion. And there's some debate. Some people say that Penn specifically invited the Anabaptists. Most people agree that he probably didn't. He may have met some Anabaptists when he was visiting some Quaker colonies in Germany and such, but that's not to say he didn't welcome them. But in 1683, so this is actually before the Amish-Mennonite split, you'll notice about 10 years before that, the first group of Mennonites moved to Pennsylvania, to America, and they settled in Germantown, which was just outside of Philadelphia. I think today, with Philadelphia expanding, it's now a part of Philadelphia. And Germantown was not a Mennonite settlement. It was led by a Lutheran pietist by the name of Francis, I forget his last name. But there were Mennonites there. They had a Mennonite congregation there. This is kind of pointed to as the date of the first Anabaptists, but there were other Anabaptists that had been here. There's evidence that they had been here before. There was apparently a colony or a settlement that was founded on the Delaware River that was eventually wiped out. And there were also various kind of like individual Anabaptists here and there throughout the Americas. Massachusetts Bay had a couple that were like excommunicated from their colony for being Anabaptists before this, but this was the first like group of them that came and had a congregation that followed throughout the centuries. And in this colony, Mennonites lived side by side with other denominations. They even shared some meeting houses with them and learned to live side by side with the Lutherans, with Quakers, of course, and learned to live with them. And it was actually through Mennonite support, through voting, over the next couple of decades that the Quakers held the majority in the Pennsylvania government. The Quakers were aligned with the Mennonites on a lot of their values, as far as wanting peaceful relations with the Indians and so on. And so the Mennonites wanted them in power, and we're very glad to have them in power, especially because they kept freedom of religion as well. But in coming to America, many of these Mennonites had unknowingly, because they didn't speak English, sworn allegiance to the king. They had signed an oath that they would be loyal to him. And I should have mentioned there. At this point, they were mostly called Mennonites, or at times Mennonists. It seems like Mennonists was used almost more at that point, but then eventually it shifted into Mennonites because even though they were from Switzerland, because a lot of these had come through the Netherlands to get here. They relied on support from the rich Dutch Anabaptists to get here, and then in doing so, they got associated with the Mennonites, and when they came here, we got called the Mennonites. So even though we weren't from the Netherlands, where Menno Simons was. We still carry his name because they helped. Because it was a very expensive venture to come across the ocean, and it was also risky. A lot of them lost their lives. It wasn't just let's go to the New World and it'll be awesome. So I want to give you a hypothetical, and I think you can probably see where I'm going with this. But let's say that today, the state of Pennsylvania decided that it was going to break away from the Union, and it told you not to pay any of your taxes to any of your federal taxes. What would you do? Taking into account what we read in the Bible about honoring our leaders and paying taxes, what do we do with that? You don't have to necessarily answer, but that's the question that the Mennonites were faced with in the Revolutionary War. And I think sometimes because we read American history books and we know who won, we kind of get swept along with this narrative that the American colonies were in the right completely and that they were the noble ones, when in reality they were a rebellion. They didn't want to pay the taxes that their government was telling them to pay, and they didn't want oversight from that government. They didn't want that government having their military in their area. So when you're a Mennonite who believes very staunchly in living by your word, you sign an oath of loyalty to the king, and now some colonists are rebelling and saying, we're not going to pay these taxes. What do you do? Well, most of them stayed loyal to the king. They believed that the king was their rightful ruler, and they were willing to sit around and wait and say, like, if there is a change in government, that doesn't concern us. We will be loyal to the government that is over us. But at this point, the king is our authority, and we're going to be loyal to him. And so that made them very unpopular, especially among all the colonists who were rising up. And they started falsely accusing them of various things, of treason, basically. And then, in 1777, Pennsylvania, for the first time in its history, created a military draft calling for all able-bodied men between 18 and 53, and Pennsylvania also required an oath of allegiance. So suddenly Pennsylvania is asking them to swear their allegiance, or at least affirm it, and that would directly contradict the oath of allegiance that they gave to the king. And in this draft, those who did not enlist were required to pay a fine for a substitute. And the Mennonites didn't know what to do with this. They said they shouldn't, sign this oath of allegiance. But there was also differing opinions on whether they should even pay this fine, because this fine goes directly to the war effort. Eventually, the government actually changed the words in it to call it a tax, because Mennonites believe in paying taxes, so we'll just call it a tax and then they'll pay it. And some did. Some thought that's the government's right. They have a right to taxes, and we are to pay our taxes. Others thought we shouldn't pay it, and so there was some disagreement there. And we'll talk more about that later. What was I going to say? But yeah, so they disagreed on that. And then as a result of the war as well, when the war came down from New York and started coming to Pennsylvania, their farms were ravaged again. They were, their horses were stolen. Some of them even were at the point where if the soldiers were going to come along and steal their horses, they were like, oh, can we drive them? You can have our horses, but we have to drive them. And then once the army was done with them, they'd bring their horses back because they really wanted their horses. But their farms were ravaged, and then also Mennonites were accused of treason for selling their goods to the British. So when the British came into Philadelphia, a lot of these Mennonites in Pennsylvania realized that they could go to Philadelphia and sell their goods there. They could, again, be more loyal to the king, but also that money was worth a lot more than the money that the colonies were printing, which was almost worthless. But because of this, they were often accused of treason and of siding with the king, which a lot of them were. But this led to some pretty brutal stuff, including tarring and feathering, which is crazy to think that that happened in the 1700s. But they would just pour hot tar over someone and then put a bunch of feathers on them and make them run around town as humiliation and also a little bit of torture. Yeah. But that's stuff that they actually faced just 250 years ago for their beliefs. I think sometimes when we talk about persecution, we idealize it a little bit. I mentioned, we've heard it several times tonight, that when they got comfortable, they started losing some of their values. And that's true. But that's not to say that, and so then we hear that and we think, oh man, persecution just, makes such a good community and makes you so, you just know your values so much more. And that's true to some extent, but that's not completely true. Because as I mentioned, I actually didn't mention it with the Amish split, that happened in 1693 when the Anabaptists in the Alsace and the Palatinate were still being persecuted. They were still under persecution when the Amish and Mennonites split. And here, there was also some disagreements. Just because they were being persecuted didn't mean they were united. Bishop Christian Funk was kind of at the heart of this. He was more favorable to the revolution and supported paying this oath tax. And he was accused of taking the oath as well. Some people said, oh, he actually took the oath of allegiance and he's on the side of the revolution. He denied that, but he did, he said we should pay this oath. Oh, I know what I was going to say. This oath of allegiance was really hard because, like I said, they got to the point where they said, if this is a real rebellion and the colonies govern themselves, we'll submit to that government. But as for now, the king is our governor, is our authority. But Pennsylvania was now requiring them to make this oath before that was even completely fully there. So anyway, Christian Funk sided more on this side. One of the things was that he read the Pennsylvania Constitution, or the proposed Constitution anyway, and it supported freedom of religion and also freedom from military service for those who wanted to be exempt. And so he was like, hey, this government seems a lot better, we should support this. And he probably didn't go quite as far as he was accused of going, but he was still on that side more. So Funk was, as I said, a bishop of the Mennonite church, but he was deposed from his office as bishop and excommunicated from the church. This led the Funkites, led by, I say Christian's brother. It was also, differing sources say different things, but it was led by Christian also some. It wasn't just Henry. It was Christian and Henry and I think maybe another one of their brothers and maybe a nephew or something were kind of the main leaders of this group called the Funkites, who broke off from the other Mennonites when Christian was excommunicated. And this was the first schism among the American Mennonites. First of many. But yeah, so this was a time of persecution that they were facing. It was also a time of unrest. Eventually, the colonies won, of course, and the Mennonites submitted to that authority and said, this is our government now, and we will pay taxes to it and support it as well. Do you have any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on how we relate to a government that is in flux like that, and how we deal with that, and how do we deal with our government today? in light of that.
How long have you been with us? 10, 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, the revolution itself was from 76 to 81, so that's 5 years plus some unrest on both sides. But yeah.
I think even looking back, it looks like a complex issue.
Hmm.
Seems like a lot of things in history, look back, it's like, oh, there's where the mistake was made. But looking back here, it's like, I don't know what the solution was.
Hmm.
Just a note, maybe you're going to reference the book that talks about that, but the book was Seeding Time. It's in our church library, and it goes through and very, very readable and interesting story of this exact issue. And yeah, I know it seems like reading it, I sympathize with both sides that are coming out.
Hmm.
Would have to be very challenging because we already take sides of our government. We
Hmm.
have two sides of the government now,
Hmm.
so we have our opinions, and I'm sure it was exactly that.
Yeah. Yep.
And Jesus said we should give to him and ask for us. So that would be a dangerous position to be in.
Hmm.
And it's definitely complicated because they're required then to fight, kind of being required by both parties to
Hmm.
participate. They didn't want to participate in either, but were accused of helping each side.
Right.
They gave them food while, hey, they're supporting the British. Hey, they're running
Hmm.
Pennsylvania.
Some of them, I know where we approved Canada.
Yes, that is something that I think the book mentions, that there was some of them that just moved to Canada, solved the problem for them. And that's the origin of the Ontario Kitchener colony or settlement that's there. There's a big community there now. But yeah, that was something that was faced not only by Anabaptists in America, but also in Europe in the earlier, was when the Ottomans were modern day Turkey. The Ottoman Empire was coming up into Europe, and they were kind of the big enemy that Europe was trying to fend off. And these Anabaptists refused to go to war, and so they were being accused of siding with the Turks. And it was the same thing of, oh, you're not going to fight with us, then you're against us. And how do we deal with that? That's something that we don't have to deal with too much today, and yet I think in some ways we do. I don't know. I think about it a lot with the Christian nationalist movement, and especially I think because a lot of their values, or the people who are Christian nationalists, their values seem to be aligned with our values, and so it can be easy to just kind of blend into that. But if we're really, if they really found out that we were not with them, what would their response be? And how would they feel when, we say that, yes, we respect America, but it's not our first kingdom, that we answer to God's kingdom first. And I can just see, it's not something that I think is a big deal now, but I think it could be with the fervor around Christian nationalism, if they find out that we're not actually with them.
It's not a place where we're becoming very wealthy, and so
Mm-hmm.
it is easy for us to jump on, just to be honest, the Trump
Mm-hmm.
train because
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So how did it work out for the Mennonites to be voting for the Quakers? They were actually voting your thing.
Mm-hmm. I don't know much about that. I think a lot of it was just like, for them, it was such a small colony that it was kind of an extension of like, oh, we have a settlement and it's led by a Lutheran, and they're electing another leader to lead this settlement, and yeah, we'll vote on that. And then soon it's just, it's a bigger colony and it's still pretty small, but like these people, and so you're voting for them and you put your vote in and so on. But yeah, I don't know how that got, and then it grew eventually and whatever. And I don't know when that would have stopped. I'm guessing probably at the Revolution, but I don't know for sure. I don't know if you have more with that, Conrad.
Yeah, it would have stopped the revolution, and even a little bit before that, with there was contention between the Irish Protestants and the Quaker government, because the Quakers weren't doing anything about Native American raids,
Hmm.
and the Irish just finally took it into their own hands and went on wild ways of their own. I agree with the way you said how it started, almost like electing a trustee or somebody to take care of social duties and things like that. But toward the end, the Quakers and the Mennonites were desperately trying to hold on because they were really concerned about the violence that was starting to crop up, and it was just too late.
So it was called an experiment.
Mm-hmm. Holy experiment. Mm-hmm.
Going back a little bit further, was it Michael Sattler that said he would rather be a Muslim than a Catholic?
I think so. Yeah, that's one of those. I was trying to remember who it was, but I think it's so.
Fuel to the fire?
Yeah. Yeah. Michael Sattler was not afraid to speak his mind. All right, well, that's all I have for tonight. Conrad, did you want to close out yet? Okay. All right, well, I'll lead in prayer. Yep. Let's pray.